What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. I'm your host, Nick Giordano. Glad you could be here. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. I have a great guest for today, Kyle Seraphin, former FBI agent, recovering FBI agent, FBI whistleblower. And he's going to be here. We're going to talk about his story of the corruption that we're witnessing within the system. And then I also want to get his take on some of the events that we're witnessing overseas. Kyle, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm glad you could join me because I really have to say the Suspendables is doing an amazing job out there exposing the corruption within the system. So I just want you to tell my audience your story about what happened to you at the FBI.
Sure. Well, so the backstory is I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm an American citizen. I'm a U.S. Air Force veteran. And so those are kind of the things that stay with me. I'm also a former FBI agent because I signed on with the FBI in 2016. I was 35 years old when I went to Quantico, which is a little bit old for a lot of the types that start off. Maybe that was probably the problem for the Bureau. It works out well for me, I guess. And I showed up with certain expectations, having worked in military special operations, having trained at some pretty high levels, non-deployed Air Force guy that did a lot of hard things and saw what it looks like to do sort of elite level performance, and then didn't see that at the FBI right away. But I went in with an open mind, was assigned to the Washington field office. I did 2 years of work in counterintelligence on the Chinese threat. I did 3 years of working in a specialty surveillance role, which was actually not all that coveted, if you can imagine. People wanted to come and stay in the office. I wanted to be out there where the action was in the streets, which meant kind of like peeing in a bottle and watching bad guys do hand-to-hand drug transactions or rob banks or whatever it might be. And I got a pretty good look at the counterterrorism program by doing that, since that was where a lot of our funding came from. And then hoping to escape DC and politics and sort of the swampy morass that exists in Northern Virginia and that area where I was working, I put in for a voluntary transfer, which landed me in New Mexico, where you think maybe nobody will ever notice me out here and I could just ride out my days and be a guy who runs down bad guys on an Indian reservation. And that is the opposite of what happened, because in October of 2021, I got an email from one of the supervisors in the office. He'd passed it down along to me, that said that the FBI was going to be creating a new threat tag under the counterterrorism program to look into parents at school board meetings, which was an immediate flag to me because I had heard 5 days earlier that the Attorney General of the United States said we weren't going to be doing that. And so that looked to me like a perjury problem. And I brought that to my member of Congress. And unfortunately for me, at the same exact time, the Biden administration had passed the Executive Order 14043, saying that they were going to be requiring a COVID vaccine for all federal employees, which was an absolute no-go for me as a pro-life Catholic who, one, had already had COVID in 2020 on duty and had taken the time off for it, and two, had some serious concerns about the way the vaccines were developed and sort of the cell lines that were used. So I made a religious argument against it, which they had the right to deny. They just didn't. They just ignored it. And then they came back to me and said, bend the knee in one way or another. You must do a COVID test every 72 hours with this emergency youth authorization test and put ethylene oxide up your nose, which I found to be discriminatory because every single person that I saw that was saying no thank you to the vax was also a pro-life Christian. So for me, that was another big flag. And so I kind of called that as well. And I said, look, I've got a top secret clearance. I've been a paramedic for a decade. If you can't trust me to stay home with the sniffles and a box of Kleenex with the hundreds of hours of sick leave I have, then maybe I shouldn't have a security clearance. And that's what happened. They took my security clearance. They pulled that in April of 2022. And I became an indefinitely suspended FBI agent for about a year. And in April of this year, I told them, I acknowledge that we have broken up. You fired me, but you don't want to call it that. I'll say that I resign if that's what it takes, because they actually accused me of several felonies and some other kind of fake nonsense. They went through this internal, investigation, and the government investigated the government, found that the government was not culpable for any of the wrongdoing of the government, which is kind of the way that works. So since then, I've been calling it out pretty loudly and pretty proudly.
Yeah, as you should. I mean, it's pretty apparent that obviously one of the unwritten policies of the FBI is that you don't speak out against the FBI. And if you criticize or complain, the FBI will use all the levers of power in order to destroy you. Is that a fair assessment?
It's totally fair. And I actually tried to do this during the internal channels. I started in probably 2018. I went to the office of the Inspector General and called out some of the supervisors I had who were doing some things that were they were against employment law. I went in 2019 and I made some allegations about the way the surveillance program was run, which were a serious problem. And that went to the Office of General Counsel for the main FBI letting them know that they were in fact having agents work hours, but claim that we weren't working on those hours in order to cut overtime spending, which becomes a giglio problem, which is to say that you're lying under oath when you swear and attest that your paycheck is properly, reflective of the hours you work. So that's a problem. And I did a lot of these things as I kept going on. 2020 was kind of a weird time for COVID. 2021, I ended up doing all this whistleblower complaints, but all these things end up in sort of the dustbin of history if you don't have, $1 million or $2 million to basically sit on and coast through government funded lawfare, I guess, against you, right? So I went to the Equal Opportunity board and they were ineffective. I went to the Office of the Inspector General and that was ineffective. I used the FBI Agents Association, which is a nightmare and useless. And so all these things are sort of in name only protections. There is actually no whistleblower protection for federal agents who want to call out malfeasance. So we kind of created our own version of that, it turns out.
Well, you need to. I mean, it really is disgusting how the government has these unlimited resources. It could drag people through the ringer, bankrupt them because it's not easy to hire a lawyer and keep that a lawyer working if you can't pay them. And right. they literally bankrupt them. And even when you're vindicated, your name is still tarnished. You are broke. And so you're vindicated. Big deal. Your life is already destroyed. So they really know how to get to people. And I find it interesting. So they tell you, you see this threat tag system coming down the pike, you criticize it. I find it amazing that a few months ago, Director Christopher Wray was testifying before Congress, and he stated unequivocally that he never saw any evidence to justify this expansion of looking into parents at school board meetings. He never saw any increase in threats. And so we're getting all different stories from the bureaucrats and their testimonies. How come none of them are ever held accountable when it comes to things like perjury?
It's a great question. I guess that's the question that I probably have as well. I think it comes down to the fact that Congress is a little bit scared of what to do, and they're also paralyzed by general inaction. Right now, 50% of our government, which represents 50% of the people in the United States, if you look at the sort of partisan split, they want the FBI as an attack dog, and that's beneficial to their cause. At least they think it is. I think it's actually antithetical to their causes and all-American liberty. But then the other half, wants some action, but they're just getting lip service. So we get this kind of kabuki theater where one side goes out and says, oh, these government officials are so honorable and they're so loyal and they're such good people. And look at their great credentials and look how bad Donald Trump is. And then the other side of the coin says like, they're weaponized and they're going after, people. And what should we do? We should defund them. But nobody has the votes to do anything. So they all just kind of talk. And then they go on, NBC or they go on Fox. And that's the end of it. And American people are kind of left in the lurch.
Well, I think what always amazed me was Senator Chuck Schumer when he was on Rachel Maddow's show, and he warned about President Trump criticizing the intel agencies. And he literally stated live on air that if you go after the intel agencies, they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. And to me, that was like, whoa, I mean, you're the one with the power of oversight and you live in fear of these agencies. Shouldn't that spell that there's some sort of problem within the system? And yet nobody batted an eye about this. So it really is concerning. And I'm interested in your time frame. So you come in as President Trump is winning the election, becoming president of the United States. The FBI is opening investigation into him. How political did things start to get within the ranks? I mean, obviously the top leadership, we already know is corrupt. It's a cesspool in the top leadership. But I'm talking about within the ranks because I always hear, the rank and file, they're not the ones that are biased. They're just following orders. How political is it really behind the scenes? And how much worse did it get over your years in the FBI?
So the scary thing, I think, for most people to realize is that while federal law enforcement is law enforcement, and so therefore it is pretty conservative, people who carry badges and guns tend to be conservative in this country. They have kind of a law and order mentality. They're either conservative, lowercase c, or they're libertarian minded and they kind of want to stay out of people's business. They are still the minority of the entire FBI. The FBI employs somewhere around 37,000 employees. About 13,600, just under 14,000 are agents. And so you're already the minority of that agency. And then even if you have the majority of agents acting in a conservative way and generally libertarian speaking, they want to protect individual liberties, they're still the minority in a big way compared to the bigger FBI. The second thing is, and I know you've talked to my buddy George Hill about this, the FBI took on and intel focus. They became an intel agency primarily, with the law enforcement being a secondary cause. And when that happens, you hire a lot of intel people. Now, old school intel people may be pro-America, but more and more of them are long time living in the academic environment. They are captured ideologically, I think, by the political left. And so you now have this leftist thread that is running in on the new hires, the 20 somethings that are coming in and doing intel analysts, that are doing the SOS role, which is like a tactical intel. You've got the new agents are coming in 25, 26, 28. They're coming out of law schools with no work experience. So less and less of the agent pool are coming from the military and from prior law enforcement backgrounds. So they don't understand constitutional law, and they're getting whatever they're fed in both academic institutions and then, the mainstream media. So that starts tilting it. And I can just tell people to look at this. We've had people like Mark Hout, who was a pro-life Catholic who was arrested on a FACE Act violation. We've seen the DOJ aggressively go after pro-life protesters. We've seen them going after what they're calling DVEs, or domestic violent extremists, which tend to lean almost exclusively to the political right. Some of them in the white supremacist realm, not really conscionable, but a lot of them falling under what they call militia violent extremists, or now this anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist tag. And those are pretty much exclusively politically, right-leaning folks, none of which have to do any violence. So that's really scary. And when you see all of these things leaning, what we know is that you're outnumbered. And the people that are affecting those arrests are frontline agents. They're frontline supervisors that are signing off on the federal Form 888, which is your ops plan for an arrest warrant, and the search warrants. So all of these things are being done by people on the front lines. It's not the Sean Hannity, like there's 1% corrupted at the top. It goes through the entire bureau, and then all of the support staff kind of is a suspect to me at this point.
And you brought up two important points. So first, I want to take the intel component to this. When it comes to law enforcement, a crime gets committed, law enforcement investigates and arrests and prosecutes. How does the intelligence function change that?
Well, it's really easy for people to see it in a graphical format. So imagine that a law enforcement function is linear. Something happens, that's step one. You move a little bit to the right afterwards, and we find out, what was the motive, what was the actual thing that was taken, what was the thing that was scammed, whose violence, was enacted, and then we move forward. Was there an organization? Who's responsible? You gather evidence, you do interviews, you bring it to a grand jury, or you bring it to an assistant United States attorney and get a criminal complaint or an indictment, and then we either have a plea deal or we go to trial, and then there's a couple outcomes that can come out of it. It's all linear, and at the end of it, we have a result. But intelligence is very different from that. Intelligence is a constant process. It's circular. And so if you can imagine that you can drop into a circle at any time and start turning around it in a clockwise way, you're going to find out some people, you're going to find out what they do, you're going to find out who they talk about, that spins off more circles. And so just imagine a whirlpool of more and more, circles that are spinning off. That's the nature of intelligence. There's unlimited work, which is great for government because they love funding and they love to be able to build programs. But as far as for civil liberties, it's absolutely terrifying because there's no allegation of a crime that is required. It's simply, you're an interesting threat actor, and I'm using the term threat actor in kind of air quotes, right? But you're an interesting threat actor. What are you involved in? Who are you talking to? What is your rhetoric? Who has inspired you? What sort of communications do you have? Who's else in your circle? Can we continue to expand this outward? And the more intel we get, the more that we can build a bigger program. And that's sort of the goal of government, but it doesn't really have to culminate in any sort of end result where the American people say, aha, you're the violent problem, you're the issue, and so we're going to engage in criminal prosecution. They're not even incentivized to have criminal prosecution. They get bonus points for simply running more and more what they call sort of sensitive techniques or sophisticated techniques, whether it be FISA or whether it be, close monitoring, or whether it be a national security letter, which is a secret subpoena to get your bank records and exploit those, or running a undercover operation. We have undercover operations for the FBI that literally are not designed to find out if there is, in fact, a criminal underpinning to whatever's going on. They're simply to gain more information about what's going on in a threat landscape, if you will.
And that should terrify everyone. I mean, I was in emergency management and homeland security. So intelligence is an art. It's not a science, number one. Intelligence is designed to prevent things from happening, which ends up turning into amorphous threats that really can't be defined. But more importantly, it's preventative, right? I mean, that's what the intel function, you're trying to prevent things from happening. crimes that haven't yet been committed. And therefore, it's easy to abuse this power. And we're seeing it. I mean, you announced at the beginning of the program that you're a Catholic. So I'm blaming you for the FBI's Richmond product that started targeting traditional Catholics.
That's it. Well, I found that, honestly. Like, I had someone bring it to me, and I was the guy who exposed it. So that even tells you further about the work we're doing. People inside the Bureau are scared, and they're throwing the flag. And that person, by the way, was not a Catholic. But that should be antithetical to all people's understanding of where the First Amendment boundaries are. And the FBI covers it, like all intel agencies, with a caveat saying we don't engage in investigations into protected First Amendment liberties, and then they just do it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, listen, I looked at the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, and there were so many parts of it like that they wouldn't get involved in free and protected speech and blah, blah, blah. And now we have the Missouri versus Biden case where there's censorship all over the place. It really is disgraceful. But you brought up another point about anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists. Now, those things were defined several years ago. We have definitions. However, in 2021, we saw something change. We saw a morphing with the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, where the threshold was lowered. No longer was it going to be anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists. They ditched the word violent, and they changed the word extremist to sentiment. So now anyone that expresses anti-government, anti-authority sentiment is potentially a domestic violent extremist and can be investigated for domestic terrorism. How concerned are you that the threshold has gotten that low?
It's the worst thing that can happen to this country's civil liberties. Like, there's no question about it. It is a blurring of the line. And on top of all that, the thing that's so scary is, one, I saw that as well. I saw them start to move that up into what we call banded threats, which is sort of the tiering and the prioritization of who they're going to be looking at. And they kind of floated this thing called militia violent extremists for a little while, and they wanted to see if that would catch. But it turns out there's a big backlash when you start adding like all the local police departments who have a Punisher skull on their SWAT team patch, and you start adding every single veteran who's got that tattoo, or a Betsy Ross flag. That doesn't work real well. So they're kind of going the same way, but they're literally looping in anybody. Let's say you're a Patrick Henry fan and you say something like "give me liberty" or "give me death" is a sentiment that needs to be expressed right now in this country. That puts you on the watch list there. And what needs to be also stated is, to be investigated as a anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist does not mean that there's an allegation that there's any criminality there. It's an intelligence investigation. It's under the national security banner. So when you start investigating threats, again, it's very hard for people to imagine there's an investigation and it has nothing to do with a crime. There's no allegation that there's a crime. They're not even saying that there's going to be a crime in the future. They're literally trying to get ahead of a threat. And then the really scary thing is, which is the worst part about government, they're incentivized to actually find that threat because they predicted it. So now they have to go out and find it. And I'll give your listeners kind of a taste. In 2022, there was an expectation by the FBI set out in their forecast, because they do it at, like every government agency, they forecast what they're going to do. They forecasted the disruption of 600 terrorist events in 2022. In that financial year, in that fiscal year. And they didn't hit their mark because they guessed beforehand. They came up with a number, and at the end of the year, they were at 397 disruptions of terrorist activities. So you have to believe that the FBI disrupted a terrorist action on average every single day and literally twice on Sundays. That was the average. And that just tells you that they're baking the stats, because everybody can look around in their community and go, I live in a decent sized city. I know a bunch of people. I haven't heard of a single terrorist action that has been disrupted by the FBI. And so they fudge them. They're going out and they're having 14 people involved in a fake conspiracy, and all 14 of those people get arrested on different days. That's 14 independent disruptions of the same fake plan. It's the Gretchen Whitmer case. I mean, they probably got 15 or 30 disruptions out of that alone. And we can all imagine how exactly realistic that was when people start looking into the reporting that people like Julie Kelly have done. It's just not real. They're not real threats that could ever materialize, but they are the way that the FBI pays the bills. That's their budget.
Yeah, and that's the frightening aspect to me. I mean, listen, I'm seeing this go on all the time. You have the government come out there, and let's be honest, when it comes to terrorism, the government has to be right 100% of the time. So if there really is that many threats that do exist, you could, just by using logic and common sense, saying that one of those threats would have had to have been executed, would have been successful. One of them would have slipped through the cracks. The fact that none of them have tells you everything you need to know. But it's like the whole white supremacist thing, right? We keep hearing that white supremacy is the greatest threat that this country faces. Now, I'm someone, again, been around a while. When it comes to something like the Italian mob, the FBI has the flow charts, who the boss is, what's the command and control structure, what are the operational capabilities, what to be on the lookout for. When it comes to groups like Al-Qaeda, we have the same thing. Yet, how come when it comes to white supremacist organizations, they don't name these organizations, they don't list who's in charge of these organizations, they don't list the command and control structure of these organizations or the operational capabilities, and we know nothing about them, yet they're supposed to be the greatest threat we face? Well, if the American public doesn't know what to look for, well, then how could they possibly be the greatest threat? So can you explain how that's all been a bunch of nonsense that they're putting out there?
Well, you'd have the org chart would have a bunch of like either federal undercovers or confidential human sources in it, because the FBI is trying to meet a demand that they have already forecasted. Once again, they forecasted a certain demand. The actual organic supply of white supremacy does not meet that demand that has been forecasted. So they're going to go out there and do it for political purposes or anything else. I think the people that go out and investigate so-called white supremacy, they have an honest attitude about it. They're trying to do the thing they're trying to do. They were told to do it. So they're going to go after and look for these guys. But I've seen what these guys look like. I've done on probably a dozen priority, like national priority, flown across the country and been on surveillance looking at them. And they're like 22-year-old college students who wear loafers and khakis and a polo shirt and drink a latte and like tweet something racist or something, or they're on Reddit engaging and saying a bunch of violent rhetoric or stupid rhetoric. And when you go and you introduce an undercover into them, and I've been on the cover missions for those as well, where we're literally putting undercovers into a restaurant with these types and trying to say, hey, okay, we want to back your play. We think you got the right idea here. We'd like to help you out with guns and money and ordnance or whatever it is you're trying to go do. Are you ready to go get this thing and take it to the next level? And they're like, no, I kind of want to meet a girl and maybe hold hands with her and maybe get a job. And I got to go home and check in with my mom. And, so it's just not the real threat that has been forecast. We did one. There's a group called the Rise Against movement out of Los Angeles. They may be out of nationally, but they were in Los Angeles, this case. And so we go up and we flew up into Alaska to go watch this guy, because at any moment he could meet with all the white supremacists that are up in Alaska. Apparently, I didn't see them. I saw a lot of like wolves that were running around in the open area, because we're out in this like rural part outside of Anchorage. And end of the day, the guy goes up there, he hangs out with his family members, he gets a big backpack together, puts it in the back of a truck, him and a sister and a dad maybe throw this backpack, they take a truck for a couple hours into the interior of Alaska, jumped on a bush plane and flew off. And like that was $10,000 a day of FBI surveillance for a week, watching a guy who was going on a camping trip with his family. And so how do you justify all that that funding? Well, we have to write it up. And eventually they did arrest him for bad ideas, it seemed like. I mean, he might have been a racist prepper, but the guy wasn't out there inciting violence. He wasn't getting involved in anything. And so they just tag it to this intelligence investigation under the designations are 266. That's all the domestic sort of terrorism versus the 415 designations of international terrorism. And they just are incentivized to hit these numbers. So they're just playing the game. Is this guy international? Is this guy going to be? They actually got so screwed up and sideways at one point in late last year that they panicked. They had too many 266 hours billed for agents working cases and not enough 415 international. And so they tried to see, do we have any white supremacists that are also in chat rooms where we've seen ISIS guys? And can we cross-pollinate? And can we change these 266 numbers and fudge them over to 415s? Because otherwise we're going to lose $300 million worth of federal funding to our terrorism budgets. That's crazy. I mean, they're literally just playing a shell game like an accounting firm, and none of it makes a difference for the American people. Honestly, like nobody is any more or less safe other than, I guess, the bank accounts of the federal agents.
Well, I mean, it was a few years ago. I was reading about a case where the FBI got involved in a white supremacist group. They took them down. But when you're reading the case, it was literally like a local street gang. They may have expressed racist sentiment, but in the case file itself, they were arrested for drug dealing and gun running. And the crazy part was that they were working with Black gangs and Hispanic gangs doing the drugs and the gun running. So it really is amazing. Now, last week, and I spoke about it on Wednesday on my podcast, we have Newsweek report with an FBI coming out stating that investigations are being opened up into run-of-the-mill Trump supporters. Can you explain what's going on to the audience and what threat this is, how this changes the dynamic?
Yeah, so in theory, an anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist could fit either side of the political aisle. It's not one side or the other that could do it. If you're an Antifa type and you want to go and set up a chop zone somewhere in Seattle, then theoretically that would be what you're part of. And if you're a BLM, hate the government and you think that it's because they're so mean to Black people and you want to go and shut that down, then that would make you fall under that label. But in reality, the only people that are getting targeted on their political right, which is kind of what I mentioned earlier, and that comes from a leftist mindset that it has sort of captured DOJ. These are, consider this. people who work in government tend to believe in government as a solution because they're sort of financially obligated to think that way. If you work in the private industry, you can at least be a little bit more flexible. But if you're a government contractor or you're a federal agent, you think, hey, government's really important because it's really important to me, pays my bills, so I better believe in that. And so you have these people that are sort of perversely incentivized to think that way. And that's what the administrative state or the so-called deep state really is. It's people that have basically spent years and years working for either intelligence agencies or executive agencies, and they're loyal to these agencies. And also they're kind of loyal to their comrades and their paycheck, and their entire reputation, their entire financial well-being is wrapped up in those things being successful. Now, if you actually use that and then add a political tinge to it, like the Lisa Monaco types, who was the number 2 over at DOJ, and, is really running the show when Merrick Garland just really wanted to be a judge or a justice, and he doesn't have that choice. He's kind of just a placeholder. The people that are motivated have been there for 30 and 40 years, and they've outlasted every single president, and they have no accountability. Like, you're not going to get rid of that person if you're the chief executive. And so amusingly, I walked into the FBI in 2016, watched Trump get elected, heard people crying the next day at the FBI Academy. I literally laughed myself into tears that night because I just thought it was so funny. And I wasn't a big Trump supporter. I just thought it was funny that so many people were so sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win and she didn't. That to me was amusing.
And then, they're so emotionally invested in it.
Oh my God, they're rolling up. They're like Van what's his name? Van Jones that was crying on CNA. Same kind of thing. And like that was happening at the FBI Academy with like women that were FBI agents. And so you go like, oh, that's strange. And then you get to the field office and you think, well, there's a new executive, so there must be like kind of a new game plan. But that was not the case. It just wasn't. And you could see that there were people working. It doesn't matter what the FBI director was, even though theoretically he was a Republican, but now he said he's a communist or whatever the heck Jim Comey is. You got guys like Andy McCabe. You've got guys like Peter Strzok. You got them accepting money for, one of them's wife is running for office and accepting Clinton money. You got another guy that's basically going out there and telling his mistress, which by the way is far more common than people could ever imagine in the national security space, a whole lot of adultery going on.
Which in that security clearance issue is supposed to come up because that's
it used to be a disqualifier. It absolutely used to be a disqualifier for people that had a top secret clearance if you did the polygraph. In fact, my buddy George Hill told me that the old days, they would take you, if you admitted to adultery in the polygraph, they would make you confess it to your spouse in front of the polygrapher in order to continue on in the process, because otherwise you were always going to be potentially compromised by somebody who found out. So, we've moved out the door with the sort of sexual mores and the norms that exist. So you've got these very ideologically influenced people, the Peter Strzok's and the McCabe's, running the FBI just below. This is the deputy director, the number 2, the real nuts and bolts of where the FBI lives. And it's unsteerable by an executive. So the fact that they've decided to move down the line and say, we're going to go after Trump supporters, it's predictable, it's disgusting. And unfortunately, if you're part of it, if you're one of the people that goes along with that sort of thing, it's been the contention of the suspendables, whether it be me or Steve Friend or Garrett O'Boyle or George Hill, that you violated your oath because you're actually bringing something to the table that is you're not loyal to the FBI. You're not supposed to be. No. Your loyalty is supposed to be to the country. And then also, it's not even that you're really loyal to the Constitution in so much as, as an FBI agent, are you really serving the Article 1 powers of Congress or the Article 2 powers of the presidency and the executive? No. You're out there protecting the Bill of Rights and the civil liberties and not infringing on the areas that the Constitution says you shall not infringe upon, whether it be free press or freedom of being able to carry weapons and, you having constitutional searches and you're not doing cruel and unusual punishment, like all these things. Engaging in due process is your job. That actually is the goal instead of like get Trump or get Trump supporters. If you play along with that, like I'm sad for these people. I really am.
Yeah, well, I'm sad for America because it's heading us down the pathway towards authoritarianism. And I think that's clear by the bureaucracy that has gotten way too powerful, where they actually have more power than a president. It's evident. And do you think that all this focus on internal, really political opponents, because that's where the focus is, do you think we're dropping the ball in the other areas? What I mean by that is we saw the massive attack in Israel from Hamas. You're talking about 1,000 Hamas fighters. That's like a battalion. It's very logistically, that's difficult to put. There had to be complex training that went on. There had to be a lot of money behind this. And it seems odd to me that there's no other nation state involvement. Obviously, I'm talking about Iran playing a significant role in this. But do you think we don't have great human intelligence in Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and those organizations? But do you think we're dropping the ball? Do you think that we should have picked up some elements, that something was brewing, something was going on, and not so much with the FBI, but more with the NSA, where we picked up chatter or something? I mean, the fact that our officials are coming out saying that they had no evidence that this was even remotely attacked, the fact that the Mossad had no evidence that this was about to happen, that's frightening to me. And so do you think that we dropped the ball and we're missing the bigger threat that exists out there?
So some of this is a little bit out of my specialty and my scope, but what I will say is there is obviously an opportunity cost for anything that you're going to focus on. And if you're going to focus on domestic violent extremists and say that's the big deal, whereas 20 years ago we had a pretty clear idea that foreign terrorists were really the big threat to our homeland, and in fact it's the reason why DHS was stood up in the first place. The idea that you're going to basically focus inside your own house to the exclusion of other threats out there is a problem. Now, and I agree with you, it's not really the FBI's purview to know what's going to happen in Israel, but we do have a national security agency that does get an incredible amount of chatter and electronic capture. We have the CIA doing the human end and collecting this kind of information and running these operations and keeping people that are American Iranians who go back and forth. And there's all kinds of different mechanisms that if they are focused on the wrong thing, they will, of course, they're going to miss things that are relevant. The other possibility is, and this is the thing that kind of concerns me, and you can't help but think this way at this point because of all of the institutions that have
well, nothing surprises me at this point.
Well, here's the thing. It's like you have the most capable security apparatus, the most electrified border, and the most security focused state probably in the world, because in theory, Israel is basically one bad attack away from disappearing from the face of the earth. And to imagine that guys that had lawnmowers strapped to their backs were flying over in flip-flops and landing in the middle of a rave over this border that is supposedly like one of the most secure things and has,
and took 11 military bases.
Right. So all of those things tell you that, man, either they really blew it and we're all really vulnerable, or somebody on purpose fell down on the job. And that's another possibility that we have to believe, that is, at least you have to at least consider it, and it has to be ruled out before everything is said and done. I'm sure that they are going to be tearing through to figure out what went wrong, but the idea that we could sacrifice citizens is not outside of the realm of possibility for certain regimes we've seen all around the world. We saw the Chinese do it. They were happy to do things during COVID that were antithetical to the interests of their people. We're seeing the American federal government did the same thing with the CDC. I think that's really dangerous stuff. The fact that they were going and saying this is accurate, but it's not convenient to us. Like, the government even doesn't get to do that. And
well,
if they can
Kyle
do it in America,
Crawford from the CDC said to Twitter that they need to take down unapproved opinions.
That's right.
Since when does the government get to approve opinions?
The FBI thinks the same way. In fact, I've worked with some journalists and I've given them quotations. They went to the FBI for comment, particularly things about Chris Wray's use of the jet that he flies around on, which is a $60 million Gulfstream. It's one of the protected disclosures we made to Congress, that he's been essentially abusing taxpayer resources under the fraud.
He has to go to his vacation home. Come on now.
He certainly does. And he's got to go back to his actual home, which is in Atlanta. He doesn't even live in Washington, D.C., even though he's been appointed there for 10 years. And so when we made those appointments, they came to the FBI for comment. The FBI gave like their boilerplate BS, statement. And then the journalists didn't run their full statement, just summarized it. And the Bureau reached back out to the journalists. This was at Daily Wire with a guy named Brandon Trey. And they said, we're really disappointed that you didn't run our whole statement. It's like, who the hell are you? And under what circumstances did the government think that they're entitled to run a whole statement to refute something that the journalist didn't find to be relevant? He categorized it the way it needed to be, which was essentially the Bureau said nothing. So yeah, they do think they have it, like they're able to control the levers, because they actually are controlling the levers with people like CISA and some of the other agencies that have been stood up. And like you say, going back to the original question, there's an opportunity cost to doing that. If your focus is so domestic and you're so interested in trying to quell dissent within your own population, you're going to miss the real threats. And let's be real. We brought in 100,000 people from Afghanistan, and many of them are completely unvetted. And a lot of them walked off the military bases that they were stationed on, that they were being, kept on. They were not paroled into the United States under any kind of vetting program. They literally just caught an Uber on the, outside the gates. And I watched this happen by the hundreds. We would literally get updates that there were hundreds and hundreds of Afghans leaving those bases in New Mexico and in West Texas at Fort Bliss and at Holloman Air Force Base. This happened every single day while those people were there. So we have legitimate threats to be worrying about. And instead, they're worrying about me, because I might have a Betsy Ross flag hanging up on my wall, which I do.
And you're a Catholic.
Of course. And yeah, I'm a pro-life Catholic, so I'm a real problem.
Yeah, right. So, and that's what I find amazing. You got a wide open border. God only knows who came in. We already know that 284 people that have been caught on the border were also on the terror watch list. The real question is, how many didn't we catch that were able to come into the country undetected? It is frightening. And the mindset of the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats has changed. The mindset of the American citizens have changed. I mean, I never thought that they would allow government to keep them locked up in their homes and determine when, where, and how they practice their faith, and determine what businesses are essential and which ones aren't, or the fact that they have to get a shot or they're going to be fired. And yet many Americans just went along with it without asking any questions. So it really is a terrifying time. If you could have your way and do one thing to reform the FBI, what do you think the most important reform would be? Or just abolish it completely, whatever your thoughts.
I would start with abolish it completely, but I don't think there's any political will to do that.
That's
I'm not sure
they don't have cojones anymore.
It was in the Durham report, actually. So Durham went out there and stated there was no policy, procedure, or administrative rule that would change the way the FBI did this business. What needed to happen is people had to adhere to the principles of fidelity, bravery, and integrity, which the FBI nominally adheres to. They put it on their seal, but they don't do it. And if that was the case, then you wouldn't have any of the wrongdoing that happened in the Russiagate scandal and all the sort of things that went along with it. So that's the real problem. It's that people were able to abuse the powers they had simply because they didn't operate with integrity. So how do you deal with that? Maybe you take away those powers, you get rid of the intelligence capabilities, you put up that Chinese wall between them and the CIA and the NSA. I mean, I had NSA NBIDs at my desk. There were people that I could walk to when I was working counterintelligence right down the way. I had a computer program called DWS that would pull up raw FISA, and I'd be able to look into it. And if I chose to break the law, whether I understood I was breaking the law or not, in what's called reverse targeting in the FBI's 702 databases, I could do that every day. And so did a bunch of other people, because there were millions of infractions of reverse targeting that happened until last year. And last year they got a handle on it. They were only like 284,000 or something like that. It was a couple 100,000 infractions. So they've been like, well, we're doing a great job. We're breaking federal law less. The standard should be zero fail when it comes to civil liberties infringements. And so how do you allow that to operate? You just take the toy away. They can't have it. And you notice how hard they're campaigning. But I'll just say this, when people like Ralph Nadler, who's like a human version of the Penguin from the Batman movies, when that guy, and he's almost a villain in that same way for some of the policies he goes behind, when he's got a problem with 702 FISA and I have a problem with 702 FISA, then there's a problem with 702 FISA. It's got to go away. You got to start by dismantling some of these intelligence tools and really get the Bureau back to doing what people think it does. It's not even what it should do. It's what people think it does, which is law enforcement. And if you took away a lot of this sort of pre-crime sort of danger, then maybe you could get back to the original one. But it's my contention that the culture is so captured, you'd literally have to root it out down to the first line supervisors, the GS-14 level. And you might have to interview every single person for their job and have them explain to you what it means when they swore allegiance to the Constitution and what they think the limits are. And then, the other thing that we haven't talked about, and it's really, really hard to get into this, but there's a massive problem with national security and the people that are financially unwell in this country, the people that work for the federal government that are unable to go without a paycheck. They're so scared of a government shutdown that they can't even last one paycheck showing up late. Meanwhile, me and my family went for a paycheck, a full year without a paycheck, because I thought it was my duty as a guy, and I only worked for the FBI for 6 years. Your average salary there, my average salary topped out probably like just over $100,000 a year, which is good money, but it's not crazy. And we still had enough to go for an entire year without a paycheck. I would say that I was in the 0.1% of people in the FBI that could do that. And you've probably met some of the other ones, guys like George Hill, guys like my buddy Garrett O'Boyle, guys like Steve Friend, people who are suspendables knew that it was their financial duty to stand on their own 2 feet in case something came between them and their oath. And it turned out the thing that came between them and their oath was their job, which is rough. But if you can't stand up to your own employer and know that you're not going to starve, then you're going to do what you're told. And that's where we're at right now. That is what has happened with the FBI.
Well, I could tell you right now, I used to do security clearance investigations, and I could tell you 80% of the people that have security clearances don't even need those security clearances. They shouldn't have them in the first place.
That's true.
And then you have a good portion of those that have security clearances that should have never have been approved from them right from the beginning because of what we saw, and yet they still were granted the security clearance. So that is a huge problem. Kyle, I really enjoyed our discussion. Everyone needs to check out the Kyle Seraphin Show. I'm going to have links up to the P.A.S. at the P.A.S. reports to check it out. Kyle, thanks for coming on, and I hope to have you back.
Yeah, anytime you want, Nick. Thanks.